Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I wanted to talk about Wicked, specifically the book. Now, I did a video on the entire Wicked series and the Another Day series that kind of spins off of that a few weeks ago, but I saw the movie last weekend and I loved it so much. And I know the book is a very, very different beast for some people, and some people just enjoy the musical and they don't really want to read the book. And so those are the people who I'm making this video for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the whole plot of the book, all the spoilers, all the details. That way you can kind of get a sense of what's in the book if you don't ever want to read it. Now, if you do want to read it, if you are interested in reading the book, this is one of my favorite books and I do genuinely really enjoy it. So if you want to read it, don't watch this video because there will be spoilers for everything. I'm going to go through the whole plot. If you aren't interested in reading the book, or if you tried reading it and didn't like it, then you can watch this because we'll go through everything so you can get all the details without having to actually read it. This is for people who prefer the musical version and have no interest in reading the book. Okay, just so we know, there's going to be spoilers going forward. So, Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. The musical is Wicked, The Untold Story of the Witches of Oz, so it's slightly different. The plot is very different from the musical, and I'm not going to focus too much on the similarities between this and the musical, nor am I going to talk too much about the differences between this and the original Oz books by L. Frank Baum, because there are some differences there. This book exists, if you imagine a multiverse, like in, every other sci-fi series ever, this is very much its own universe. So the musical exists in a separate timeline. The Oz books, the original 14 books and all the spin-offs, whatever, that's a different universe. And then this is a separate one. So there's three kind of universes and there's plot differences, especially when you get into the fourth Wicked book. The events at the end kind of combine a couple different of the Baum books together. They kind of conflate a couple of them. So the plot is different, so I'm just focusing on this one. First off, I also wanted to show you all the illustrations because I love the illustrations in this book. This is the step back cover, and it's so awesome. It's this iconic witch, and this image is also very important in the context of the book. So there's this mythological figure called the Cumbric Witch, who exists in sort of mythology and is sort of a very ancient kind of powerful crone figure who's associated with witchcraft and the natural world, and she's, whatever. And Elphaba sort of gets conflated with her in terms of her imagery. So that's what this is. This is sort of, she sees an image of the Cumbric Witch at one point, and it's not exactly this. Obviously, this has things like, chistery, and let's see what else is in here. Oh yes, her wolf, who I think is called Killjoy, and this is the cat Malky, who's very, very important. And then we've got the tornado that brings Dorothy. So this is sort of it's sort of Elphaba's version of the Cumbric Witch, but this iconography is really important. So I know, and there's a cat here. She really likes Wicked too. Yeah, she does. All right, so I'm gonna get through this, and I spent like 5 hours this morning. I did not intend to take that long. I was just gonna like skim through the book and write down important plot points, because the wikis online don't really have a really complete run through of the plot. It's kind of difficult, and it gets harder to find all the details as the books go on. And then the Another Day books, which follows Elphaba's granddaughter and explains what happens to Elphaba ultimately and what happens to the wizard and everything, those there's no like summaries online. So I may eventually do more of these videos where I go through each of the other books, but for now I'm just going to focus on this because I think this is the one that everyone's talking about right now. I'm going to get my notes here, so because there's a lot of stuff here. Okay, so some backstory here. There's 4 lands in Oz. We've got Munchkin Land in the east, and that's sort of the breadbasket of Oz, and that's very important later. There's Quadling Country in the south. That's like a marshy land where all of its inhabitants are like skilled craftspeople, but they're looked down on by the people in the rest of Oz. Western Oz is called the Vinkus. Everyone else sort of calls them Winkies, but that's sort of like what other people call them. It's not what they call themselves. And that's sort of a grassland area. There's mountains there as well. There's sort of a tribal people that live there. There's different tribes and different kind of cultures that live there. The north is called Gillikin, and that's sort of where you got the upper class white people. It's sort of the Connecticut of the land. And then you've got the Emerald City at the middle. That's where the wealthiest people live. That's where all the power is. That's where kind of the most affluent members of society is. That's kind of where culture is decided, is in the Emerald City. Yes, I know. There's two major religions in Oz. There's a couple others, but the two big ones is there's this pagan religion called Lurlinism, which venerates the ancient fairy queen Lurline, and has ties to the Ozma line of ruler. There's this royal family, and everyone's called Ozma, that stretches back way into the past. And then the most recent ruler was a regent, because the actual Ozma was still a child. And so the regent's name was Pastorius, and he was sort of in charge when the wizard showed up. Anyways, the other religion is called Unionism, and this is very much kind of like Calvinism, but it's very strict and controlling and very, very exactly what you'd think when you think of like the Puritans. Now, there is also another religion that sort of exists on the fringes, and it's just called the pleasure faith, and it's sort of it's just hedonism, and you do what you want, and there's no rules and everything. The folks that follow this tend to be kind of a rabble-rousing mob of chaos. And then there's also a subset of that called Tik-Tok faith, which is magical animated clockwork things that do various things. Sometimes you see like a clockwork servant or person, but the big center of this is what's called the Clock of the Time Dragon, and it's a huge clockwork thing that's carried around by this mysterious dwarf who's very important, and the clock has like a stage, like a puppet stage, that opens up, and it can either predict the future or it can reveal sort of hidden truths by creating these sort of clockwork puppet shows, and people are really nuts about it. So, okay, with all that, that's a lot of context, but it is important. We're going to jump into the plot of the book. So, we start off with a couple, Melina and Frexbar, who's called Frex. Melina is the daughter of the governor of Munchkinland, but it's not governor in the sense of like an elected official, it's another hereditary thing. And Frex is a unionist minister, so he's very stiff, very religious, and he's kind of trying to stamp out vestiges of Lurlinism and the pleasure faith in Munchkinland, because he thinks it's sort of an assault on all that's good and proper. The Clock of the Time Dragon, and here I have a picture of it because the illustrations in this book are outstanding. So this is the first part, Munchkinlanders. That's the Clock of the Time Dragon. It's awesome. It's so cool. If you see the musical is set up as if the whole thing is being shown to you by the Clock of the Time Dragon. So that's why the dragon sits above the stage, and it's all got like clockwork gears and stuff whenever there's like scene changes and things. So the assumption is that the stage musical is being shown to you by the Clock of the Time Dragon. And that might be a kind of clever way to show why the plot of the musical is different from the plot of the book. But anyways, moving on. Okay, Clock of the Time Dragon. The clock is also partially sentient in a way. It's magical. We don't know what kind of activated it. But it riles up a crowd of munchkins who beat up Frex and become kind of an angry mob. And so Melina's about to give birth. She's pregnant with her first child. And she goes and hides in a graveyard and finds the clock, which has sort of been left aside. And there's the mob doing things over here. And she delivers Elphaba in the Clock of the Time Dragon. They find like a cabinet space, and she's in there. And her midwives are kind of with her. And she's green. No one knows why. And so later on, Melina recalls a dalliance with a strange man with a funny accent who gave her a potion from a green bottle that gave her dreams of another world. This is very important. And so we don't know who that is, but that might be the father of Elphaba, because Melina is very unhappy with where she is, and she's sort of, she's supposed to be kind of upper class and fancy, and she married Frex kind of on an impulse, mostly to make her parents mad, I think. And then she finds herself kind of living a normal, boring life, and she doesn't get to do anything. So she has affairs on the side. Yes, I know. When Elphaba's born, she has really sharp teeth, and she's violently allergic to water. It like burns her like acid, so she doesn't want to go near it. She doesn't have a bath or anything. Shortly after that, a quadling glassblower comes to stay with Melina, and like in the house, and they have an affair. Frex is away on a hermitage at that point, and so he comes back from the hermitage, and the glassblower, whose name is Turtleheart, yes, seriously, I know, he kind of stays with them for a while. He doesn't really have anywhere to go, and he kind of helps out, and he sort of becomes part of the family. Now, he and Frex also have an affair. We don't find out about this until much later on in the book, but Frex is sort of a repressed bisexual guy, and we wish he could just be himself, but he doesn't. But the three of them kind of end up having this weird sort of throuple, which is great if there wasn't so much shame involved. If it was just these three people living together kind of happily, I would have been great, but there's all this kind of, religious shame and guilt. Anyways, it's important. So he learned glass blowing from Turtleheart. Frex does, over time. Sidebar, so I mentioned this before, the ruler at this point is Pastorius, the Ozma regent. He's the one who builds the Yellow Brick Road. In the musical, it's the wizard who does it. And he uses it as a means of moving troops in and out of Munchkin Land. So Munchkin Land is really valuable because it's where all the grain is grown. And so Munchkin Land is sort of really important, and the Emerald City wants to make sure that they can kind of keep control of it, because if they lose it, it's very dangerous. The wizard arrives at this point, and it kind of happens, they sort of hear about it in the news. The wizard arrives, he kills Pastorius, he takes over Oz, and we have a time jump. And this is where, I'll show you the next illustration for this section. This is where we meet Dr. Dillamond. This is him. I think they did a really good job in the movie because he looks exactly like this, and this is called Gillikin. So we move to Shiz, which is in a city north of the Emerald City. So we've got Galinda arrives at Shiz a year later. Her chaperone, Amma Clutch, she steps on a nail for some reason, and isn't there to be her chaperone when she's there. So the rich girls, they have chaperones with them, and they get to have sort of private chambers because of that. Or they don't have to live in, like, on campus. They can live in houses or apartments or whatever because they have a chaperone, so it's okay. But Amma Clutch steps on a nail, and so she isn't available to be there. And so she's put into a dorm room with Elphaba, who is a student. In the musical, she's not. She kind of is invited in. But so we have Elphaba is a student there. They don't get along. Elphaba's kind of weird and off-putting. She's very bony and angular and kind of abrupt and a bit harsh. She's used to being kind of rejected by everyone and treated badly, so she's very prickly. We learn that Elphaba's family had to move to Quadling Country after a mob, riled up by the Time Dragon maybe, sacrificed Turtleheart. So poor Turtleheart, who is this sweet, innocent guy, was sacrificed by an ancient mob, and Frex and Melina had to leave, and they had to move to Quadling Country in the south. And they became missionaries to the Quadling people. Melina probably hated that. But so Elphaba grew up in Quadling Country primarily, not Munchkin Land, because they were out of it by then. At Shiz, we also meet Madame Morrible, who's sort of the head, and she's not sort of the sorcery professor, and she's not a weather specialist. She's just sort of in charge of everyone. And so at Shiz, Madame Morrible gives a poetry reading at one point of this like specific type of form poem. And there's one poem that she reads that ends with the line, "Animals should be seen and not heard." Now, there's a whole thing in here. There's a form poem that's important. And what it is, it's like lines of like rhyming couplets. And then at the very end is sort of this abrupt line that sort of has nothing to do with the poem, but is meant to be sort of a juxtaposition. I could do a whole video on just that type of form poem that McGuire invented. It's pretty great. But so the last line of this poem is "Animals should be seen and not heard," and that's kind of shocking. And Elphaba sort of debates that with Galinda, who's sort of nearby, and Galinda's horrified that she's even talking to her because she thinks it's going to ruin her standing. Galinda's wonderful, and she's a great character. Sidebar, Madame Morrible also has a creepy Tik-Tok servant named Grammatic, who is very creepy and scary, and we don't like Grammatic. Galinda's encouraged to pursue sorcery by Madame Morrible because she has an aptitude for it. Elphaba at this point meets Bach, who's a munchkin, who is very sweet and kind, and he's not kind of the creepy, clingy incel that we see in the musical. And Bach knows Elphaba from when she was very young back in Munchkin Land, but she doesn't really remember much because she was quite young. So he's a sweet guy. He kind of becomes friends with Elphaba. He likes Galinda, but is really intimidated by her because he's really nervous. But they kind of become sort of friends. Elphaba becomes critical of the wizard's attitude towards animals at this point. There's lots of hints and clues kind of all through that. There's lots of unrest. Dr. Dillamond, who is a goat and is very nice, he's murdered. It's pretty gruesome. And Galinda changes her name to Glinda to honor his life. In the book, she kind of does it more for herself than anything else. She's a little bit more aware of things. Being around Elphaba sort of affects Glinda's attitude towards things, and she becomes not quite as outspoken as Elphaba, but she does become a little bit more aware, and that's important too. It's later revealed that Grommatic killed Dr. Dillamond on Madame Morrible's orders, so she's very clearly up to something evil. At this point, Nessarose comes to Shiz, so Elphaba's been at Shiz for a few years, and then Nessarose joins them later when she gets older. So Nessa has no arms. 5 years after she was born, her mother Melina died giving birth to a son named Shell. Shell isn't super important in this book, but he does become really important in later books. So at this point, when Nessa comes to Shiz, she just has her father, and her father sort of pours all of his love and attention on Nessa. He loves her openly, whereas he sort of assumes that Elphaba sort of knows that he loves her, but he never does anything to show it. Way to go, Frex. At this point, we learn that the wizard has taken over Quadling country searching for rubies, and he killed a ton of the Quadling people, like full-on genocide, chases the rest of them out, and so Quadling country is kind of a disaster, and the Quadling people are sort of second-class citizens sort of wandering around finding work wherever they can. And it's awful. Nessa, like her father, is very religious. This also becomes very important later. At this point, Glinda and Elphaba become closer friends. They're never like effusive besties, but they do become kind of close friends. And Elphaba has sort of a positive impact on Glinda. She becomes more aware of things, and at this point, Glinda becomes sort of mistrustful of Madame Morrible, whereas Elphaba is becoming a lot more radicalized at this point. Okay, at this point, enter Fiyero. Fiyero is sort of a minor character at this point. He just sort of stumbles into a class at one point. He's a prince from the Vinkus. He's dark-skinned. He has traditional tattoos of blue diamonds on his face. When he first arrives, he's attacked by a set of antlers that comes to life after Dr. Nicodic, who's Dr. Dillamond's replacement, brings them to life with this magical powder, which I think is from the books, because there's this magical powder that Tip uses to bring Jack Pumpkinhead to life and the Sawhorse. But anyways, you know, Fiyero's there, and he kind of is noticed by people, but he's sort of shy and quiet. He's very different from the musical version. The character in the book who's most like musical Fiyero is Averick, who's a kind of outspoken, hedonistic pal in their kind of inner circle. So later on, Dr. Nicodic brings in a lion cub and asks the class to determine if it's an animal lowercase or animal uppercase, meaning is he sentient. Elphaba calls out the professor for the cruel treatment of the cub, demands to know where its mother is. The whole class becomes upset at this point. Two girls from up front actually end up taking the lion cub away from freedom. So it isn't Elphaba and Fiyero who take the lion cub away. It's just sort of two other people in the class. The lion cub, of course, does grow up to be the cowardly lion. His name is Burr, because he's like always shivering. Okay, back to Fiyero. He's already married at this point, and that's kind of a thing that they all find sort of strange because he's younger. But he has a family back home, or he has a wife. He has 3 children later. But he joins a circle of friends that kind of includes Glinda, Bok, Averick. At this point, Bok has sort of gotten over his crush on Glinda, and they're just friends. He's like a very normal, balanced person. We love Book Bok and Elphaba. So at this point, Nessa receives a gift from her father. It's a pair of slippers adorned with hand-blown glass beads, which makes them appear to be either silver or red, depending on how the light catches them, which is really important because in the books, the Oz books, the slippers are silver, and in the movie, the slippers are ruby. And so this was a way for Maguire to kind of blend the two together, and instead they're kind of covered with a bunch of little glass beads that makes them kind of catch the light a certain way. Elphaba's really crushed that she never received a gift like this, even though her father kind of makes it clear that, you know, she should know that he loves her. He doesn't have to prove it. It's pretty clear what's going on. So, at this point, Elphaba becomes increasingly frustrated with the growing prejudice and fascistic control the wizard is spreading throughout Oz. Madame Morrible becomes more outspoken in her racist views towards animals and the Quadling people. She calls them slurs, and it's not great. So at this point, Madame Morrible deputizes Elphaba, Glinda, and Nessarose to be agents of the wizard. What she wants to do is she wants to kind of train them to be sort of politically manipulative and then implant them in sort of places of power where they can allow the wizard to kind of control the populace more easier. She puts a spell on all of them so they can't talk about this with one another, and it's sort of implied that a lot of what they do is sort of subconsciously controlled by this spell. Elphaba sort of fights it the most, but there's this impression that this is what kind of causes some changes in personality that we'll see later. Averick, a friend of Bach's and a member of Glinda's friend group, suggests they all go to the philosophy club. Now, this is the part of the book that everyone is always like, tee-hee, this is the philosophy club, but it does fit into this whole thing. So what it is, it's an underground fetish club, basically. Fiyero, Glinda, and Bach join them. Elphaba and Nessa decline. They meet a strange woman there called Yakel, and she's really important, who leads them in. At this point, she's just kind of there, but there's kind of this implication that Yakel is somewhat important. One of their other friends, Tibbet, is sort of brought on stage, and he's handcuffed to a sentient tiger, and they sort of act out this sort of pagan sexual display where you've got sort of the tigers meant to represent the time dragon, and Tibbet's supposed to represent like the unnamed god, and then there's this woman with a riding crop behind them who is meant to represent the Cumbric witch, and it's all very kind of, it's meant to be titillating, but it's also kind of this sort of pagan representation of sort of paganism and the pleasure faith kind of dominating unionism. It doesn't go into detail, it just sort of sets everything up and then it cuts to black, so it isn't really that explicit, but people just kind of go nuts about that scene. But that part is really important because we get to see animals who are being used as entertainment for the upper classes, but there's also this conflict between sort of the pleasure faith and unionism, the restriction, and everything, and then the wizard is in charge at this point, and so the wizard really likes unionism because it allows him to control people, and so there's kind of this sense of like the underground of sort of people who are fighting back. Anyways, so this experience is so traumatizing that poor Tibbet is never the same again, and the poor guy sort of dies young in a later scene. But later on, Glinda and Elphaba go to the Emerald City to meet the wizard on Madame Warble's orders. It's sort of implied that they're going to sort of go there to sort of meet him, and it'll kind of inspire them to be more receptive to his desire to control Oz, and they can go off and do their thing and control the various governments as they get older. But Elphaba is really horrified at the class disparities in the city and the treatment of the animals, and it kind of makes her uneasy. So when they meet the wizard, he shows up as a sentient skeleton. Instead of sticking to the script like they're supposed to, Elphaba confronts the wizard about the animals and the treatment of animals and cites Dr. Dilliman's work. The wizard dismisses it. He ignores her concerns and then vanishes. So at this point, Elphaba decides not to go back to Shiz. In this moment, Glinda sort of realizes that Elphaba is one of her closest, dearest friends, and she even starts to think of her as a sister. And just when she sort of starts to sort of see Elphaba as someone important in her life, Elphaba says, "I can't go back to Shiz. This is wrong." And so she leaves. So this parting hurts Glinda very deeply. And so then we get another time jump. This is part 3, City of Emeralds, and we've got a spicy scene, but it's okay. There's nothing. It's all in shadow. It's fine. But that is Fiyero and Elphaba. So in the Emerald City, we've got Fiyero. He's now graduated. He's much older. He's got kids now. Fiyero runs into Elphaba, who is now working as kind of an underground resistance fighter. It's sort of implied she's working with a cell of other freedom fighters, but we don't see any of them. She's always on her own. She's working to protect animals and oppose the wizard's rule. She's cut ties with everyone at this point, including her family. Nessa's become kind of a religious zealot at this point, and her and Fiyero sort of connect because they're both sort of other. Fiyero is dark-skinned, and he's very kind of obviously from the Vinkus, and so he's very different from kind of the white Emerald City upper class people. And so they kind of connect, and he is married at this point and has kids, but they have an affair. Elphaba lives in a secret apartment with a cat named Malky, who is important, but we learn why they're important sort of later. And they kind of keep this under wraps. So while in the Emerald City at one point, Fiyero runs into Glinda, who is now married to Sir Chuffrey, who's kind of a rich member of the Gillikin High Society. And so she's just kind of a socialite. She's sort of become more shallow. She's also become much more politically conservative because at this point, she's kind of been away from Elphaba for a long time, and so she's more concerned with sort of the status quo and just making sure nothing changes, and she's not going to complain too much because she's rich and comfortable now. Fiyero doesn't reveal what happened to Elphaba to Glinda, so she doesn't know. He sees Elphaba at one point planning to kill Madame Morrible with a bomb, which is great, but at that point she's kind of in a crowd of people and there's a bunch of children nearby, and it really bothers her. So she cancels the assassination, she lets her move on, but there's something about that moment where maybe she's seen or someone near her is seen, because Fiyero is caught shortly after that by the wizard's secret police, and they kill him, and it's for sure he's dead for sure. It's awful. So Elphaba at this point is sort of distraught and broken, and she staggers to a Monterey convent outside the city and asks for sanctuary, and the Mother Superior who welcomes her in is named Yackle, so it's Yackle again. She's now the Mother Superior at this Monterey. And so we have another time jump. All right, so next up we've got part 4, In the Vinkus, and so this is Elphaba and a small figure approaching a big castle. The castle is Kiamo Ko, and that is Fiyero's castle. 7 years later, Elphaba leaves the convent after having lived as a nun there. She's joined by a child, who's the kid in the picture, who we later learn is her son. Lear is his name. She was pregnant with him when she went into the convent, and so it's Fiyero's son. Lear isn't kind of aware that Elphaba, Fiyero are his parents. He's sort of told that he has to go with her to kind of keep an eye on her. And she doesn't really talk to him very much. She doesn't feel very maternal towards him. Together they travel to Kiamo Ko, which is Fiyero's castle in the west, in order to gain absolution from his widow, Sarima. She brings with her a broom, which was given to her by Yackle, who claims that it's magical somehow, but she doesn't know how. Now, another thing I have to mention at this point, Elphaba isn't really known for having any magical prowess. Galinda was the one who kind of showed interest in sorcery and was good at magic. Elphaba never did anything magical, really, and she feels like she has no power and she has nothing to do. Her intention in going to Kiamo Ko is sort of to apologize to Sarima, get her forgiveness, and then just sort of live as a hermit forever and stay away from people because she's tired of the world at this point. In their travels, they meet a tribe called the Scrow, whose leader is a princess called Nestoya. Nestoya is an elephant, like a sentient elephant, who's disguised as a human to kind of avoid the wizard's gaze because his anti-animal laws are very, very dangerous. She's also the first one to notice that Elphaba has sort of assumed the guise of a witch. Her black habit is sort of the nun's habit that she's wearing. She also has the black hat, which she kind of gets from them. And so she looks like a witch, but she doesn't really believe herself to be. Elphaba dismisses this at one point. She's like, oh yeah, a witch, my dad would love that. Everyone kind of notices that she does resemble this sort of mythological Cumbric witch archetype. So it's either by choice, by accident, subconsciously, we don't know. As they're nearing the castle, Elphaba finds a baby snow monkey who's on an island in a lake, who's sort of abandoned, and she wants to run out and help it. She sort of cares about living creatures, just not people. But of course, water is dangerous to her. But something in her forces her to keep running, and the water kind of freezes under her. And so she uses magic somehow, but she's never had any aptitude towards magic in the past. It just sort of manifests. And she runs across and saves the baby. She names it Chistry and brings it with her. So at the castle, Elphaba and Lear are welcomed in, but Elphaba isn't allowed to unburden herself. Sarima does not want to discuss Fiyero's death. She does not allow her to talk about it. She's not interested. Sarima's children start calling her anti-witch because she looks like a witch, and Elphaba sort of runs with it. She said, fine, I'm a witch. And at this point in the book, it stops using her name, and so whenever it does like dialogue tags or whatever, she just refers to herself as the witch. So it says the witch did this, the witch did that. The name Elphaba sort of falls away as she kind of embraces this. One of Sarima's children, who's a boy named Manek, has an almost like psychopathic interest in causing Lear harm. He keeps tricking him into like accidents that could kill him. He's just psychotic. And also one of her other children, her daughter Nor, befriends Lear and is sort of kind to him. Nor is, again, kind of a background character here. She sort of becomes more important as the story goes, but she's more important in later books. At this point, Elphaba sort of lives there with them as kind of a hermit. She has her own room up in the tower, and she kind of embraces sort of the witch lifestyle, so potions and things. She begins to try to teach Chistery to talk, and while she's walking around the castle, she finds a grand magical encyclopedia in like a cabinet somewhere called a grimoire, and she can read parts of it, but she can't quite read all of it. Now, Sarima explains that the grimoire was brought to this castle by a sorcerer from another world who was looking to hide it. I should specify the sorcerer from another world is not the Wizard of Oz. It's an actual sorcerer from another world. And so this book has just been kind of hanging out in this closet forever. And Elphaba finds it, and she's really interested in it because she can read parts of it. And at this point, she's like, fine, if I'm a witch, I have a book of magic now. And so she tries to read it and tries to kind of learn how to use it. And it takes time. The book kind of has a mind of its own. It's sort of a magical artifact, and it sort of allows people to see what it wants them to see, kind of thing. At one point, Menek causes Lear to nearly drown in a well. He traps him in there during a game of hide and seek. And Elphaba notices a really large icicle that's sort of hanging above him, and somehow the icicle falls and kills Menek. It's sort of implied she could have done it. You know, she kind of takes credit for it to herself. She doesn't tell anyone else. But to everyone else, it's just an accident. And so you're left wondering, did she use magic to do it, or did it just happen? At this point, Elphaba's nanny from back in the day, when she was a kid, she comes to join them in the castle. And she tells her that the previous eminent Throp, so that was Melina's dad, who was sort of the previous governor of Munchkin Land. It's sort of an inherited title. He dies, and since Melina died in childbirth, giving birth to Shell, the thing passes on to Nessa. So Nessa now is the ruler of Munchkin Land, and she rules with kind of a religious fervor that's sort of equally popular and unpopular. Some people like it because she's a strong figure who can stand up to the Emerald City. Other people don't like it because she's very kind of controlling, but she's got sort of a hold on the people. She is genuinely a powerful ruler. Elphaba's brother Shell is now old enough that he's sort of an agitator, and he's running around stirring up support for Munchkin Land to secede from Oz. Munchkin Land is where all the grain is grown, so this is not something that Oz would ever want to have happen, but they want to kind of be their own self-governing state. She also learns at this point that Glinda enchanted Nessa's glass bead shoes so that she can walk in them. So the shoes are now enchanted that cause Nessa to be able to walk. She doesn't have arms. Lear tells Sarima that while he was drowning, this is going back to his near-death experience, a fish that lived in the well came and told him that Fiyero was his father. It's implied the fish is sort of a sentient carp or something. He thinks it's a magic fish, but it's sort of, there's a fish that lives in there, and the fish told him that Fiyero is his father. Now, Sarima dismisses this. She doesn't want to think about that, because the only way that's true is if Fiyero had an affair with someone, and she doesn't want to talk about that. So Elphaba has another chance to confess at this point, and she's not allowed to. So she still can't get absolution from Sarima. At this point, the wizard's army arrives at the castle, claims it as kind of a base of operations. Elphaba tries to scare them off, but they stay anyways. Lear is fascinated by the soldiers. He loves them. He befriends the commander, whose name is Cherrystone, and he sort of starts working for this little army camp. He like fetches water for them and stuff. Now, Nor, who's Lear's sister at the castle, she discovers that Elphaba's broom that she got from Yakel is magic, and discovers that it can fly. So she tries to fly with it, and it kind of works for her, but she's not very good at it, and she almost falls off. But Elphaba's able to kind of get her back down to the ground, and she takes the broom to herself. At this point, Nanny reveals that Nessa had no arms when she was born, because after Elphaba was born, Nanny was sent to the Emerald City for some kind of potion or something that would kind of prevent her next child from being green. So she still doesn't know what causes Elphaba to be born green, and so she wanted to find some kind of potion that would fix it. Now Elphaba meets Yakel again, and Elphaba is like, what? Surely this can't be the same woman. And she gave her some tablets, like pills, that would help. And she says that, you know, Elphaba and her sister were going to be important. So there's this impression that Yakel is sort of in the wings, sort of watching everything happening, and she's sort of subtly adjusting Elphaba and Nessa's life. And so she's kind of behind a lot of the big things that have been happening. And so Nanny took the thing, and so the tablets ended up causing Nessa to be born healthy, except she doesn't have arms. But she's not green. So at this point, Elphaba receives a letter from her father. He says that Munchkinland has seceded finally, and he wants her to come home immediately to talk to her sister. So using her broom, she kind of learns how to fly it. She flies to Munchkinland. When she first meets her father, now this is important, she does refer to herself as a witch. She says, "I'm a witch now." She kind of claims the title for herself. Up until this point, other people have been calling her a witch, but she kind of it was more a joke to her. But now she finally says, "Yes, I'm a witch." Frex reveals at this point that Nessa's shoes, the ones with the glass beads, were originally bought from a strange crone who might have been Yackle, and then he added the glass beads using what he learned from Turtleheart. So her father made the glass beads and added them to the slippers to sort of create this effect. He asks Elphaba to speak to Nessa to soften her as she's becoming kind of a religious tyrant. And Frex is religious, but this is kind of a bit much for him. At this point, things start to lead up to the Wizard of Oz book. So we got a woman from the village who comes and asks for Nessa's help with punishing a woodcutter who's fallen in love with her maid. Now, since the wizard is conscripting all of the men that he can get his hands on, they are kind of in short supply. And so the villages are it's basically just the women and the staff who are left. And so this maid is really important, and she doesn't want her falling in love with this woodcutter to kind of go away. The woodcutter is named Nick Chopper. Very important. You may know that if you've read the Oz books. Elphaba is horrified when the woman offers to pay for this service with sentient animals that she's keeping as livestock. So animals are second-class citizens to the point where they're now being kept as slaves, being kept like non-sentient animals. Nessa agrees to bewitch the woodcutter's axe to chop off his own arm. So at this point, Nessa reveals that she's now using magic, which should be kind of weird because religion is very anti-magic, but she kind of says that they're religious miracles is what she's performing. Nessa comes to be known as the Witch of the East shortly after this, so she enchants the axe, and the axe chops off anyone's arm who tries to use it. And it's not mentioned in here, but in the first Oz book we learned that every time Nick Chopper used the axe, it would cut off a limb. He went to the tinsmith to have the limb replaced, till eventually it cut off all his limbs and then his head, and then it cut his body in half, so he got all tin somehow, and he became the Tin Man. So that's the Tin Woodman. While freeing the animals that the woman gave, like Nessa, to pay for this service, Elphaba says that that must make her the Witch of the West, if Nessa's known as the Witch of the East. And so now we've got that sort of cemented in the minds of the Munchkins. They all start to call her the Witch of the West, and Nessa sort of the Witch of the East. Nessa asks Elphaba to join her in ruling Munchkinland, but Elphaba refuses and flies back to Kiamoko. Okay, so at this point, the tornado happens. So now we are up to the Wizard of Oz and everything. So Nessa, of course, crushed by a falling house. And at this point, her, Munchkinland is a free state now. And even though they were kind of okay with her leading this separation from the Emerald City, now people kind of turn on her. And so, of course, they celebrate her death because now that they're a free state, they don't have to be governed by kind of a hereditary government, and they can now be kind of democratic or whatnot. And so people are very happy that Nessa's dead. So of course Dorothy comes out of the house. Glinda shows up and she gives Nessa's shoes to Dorothy, basically to get her out of Munchkinland, because Glinda knows that Munchkinland is very unstable at this point, and she doesn't want the wizard to either get a hold of Dorothy or to get a hold of the shoe. So she kind of sends her off on what she thinks is like a fool's errand. She doesn't actually think she'll ever make it to the Emerald City, but at least it'll keep all this out of the wizard's hand. So meanwhile, back at the castle, Elphaba has been sewing wings onto the snow monkey's descendants. So Chistery, she obviously found another snow monkey at that point and was breeding them, and so she had a whole bunch, and she was sewing wings onto them and then using the grimoire to kind of complete the connection. So it wasn't just like they were just attached, they actually were usable wings. So she now knows how to use the grimoire, kind of. She takes a page out of the grimoire to take with her because she wants to show it to her father and ask him about it. She flies to Munchkinland again, runs into Glinda, who she hasn't seen in years. Glinda tells her what's happened, and Elphaba's sort of dismayed to discover that Glinda's reverted to sort of her prejudiced, narrow mindset from her early days at school. So near the end of their time together at Shiz, Glinda was sort of more aware of what was happening, but now she's sort of fallen back into old habits, and she just cares about image and, the status quo, and, You know, she kind of helps Dorothy a little bit, but she's more just interested in just kind of getting rid of problems because she doesn't want to deal with them. So the wizard at this point comes to Munchkinland. Now this is when Elphaba first meets the wizard face to face. They kind of meet privately. He tells her that he's annexing Munchkinland and reveals that he had everyone at Kiamoko killed, and he has Nor as a prisoner. So Sarima, her sisters, the other kids, he had them all murdered because he doesn't want anyone to challenge his rule. Lear is still working with the army, so Lear is safe, and Nor was captured as kind of a political prisoner. Now, he sees a page from the Grimoire, the one that Elphaba has with her, and he recognizes it and wants to know if she'll give him the rest of the book. And he says, you can have Nor back if you give me the book. And she doesn't want to do that because she knows that this book is powerful, and she doesn't want the wizard to get any more power than what he has. One thing the wizard notices at this point is that Elphaba can read parts of the book, enough that she can do the magic. He tells her that no one from Oz should be able to read this because the book is from another world. It's implied that it's sort of his world that it comes from. And he can read it, but he's surprised that she can. He asks her for the rest of the book. She refuses. She flies off. She leaves. That's the last time she ever sees Glinda. So it's kind of anticlimactic there. Elphaba at this point is sort of increasingly burdened by rage, grief, loneliness, guilt, that she was never able to ask Sarima for forgiveness. She was never able to resolve things with her sister. Her father sort of dies shortly after this out of grief because he loved Nessa more than Elphaba, and that sort of breaks her up. So her mental state is not good at this point. She seeks out Madame Morrible at this point because she wants some kind of revenge. She does find her, but she's very old and she dies like just before she gets there. She never was able to take revenge on Madame Morrible for all the horrible things that she did, especially the murder of Dr. Dillamond. And so she takes a trophy off the wall and bashes in Madame Morrible's like dead skull and then leaves because she's expecting, you know, it to make some kind of news. So at this point, she encounters the Clock of the Time Dragon. The dwarf who pulls it is sort of another mysterious figure, but we don't learn a lot about the dwarf until later books. So if I do more of these, I'll explain who the dwarf is. And so she sees it, and it kind of does like a 3-act play for her, and it shows her mother drinking the green elixir with the mysterious traveler. She doesn't understand it at this point, but this is when we reveal that the traveler who gave Melina the green elixir that made Elphaba turn green was the wizard. So the wizard is Elphaba's father, and the elixir was sort of kept at her house. So her mother kept the elixir with her. She comes back to the castle, and since Nanny came and brought all of her stuff, she finds the green elixir in Nanny's stuff. And so she drinks it and has a dream of our world. And she sees the wizard, she sees who he was. He was an Irish American, and at that point there was a lot of prejudice against Irish people. And so he goes to the ocean and tries to commit suicide. And the image of the ocean is so terrifying to Elphaba because the concept of an ocean is so foreign to her, because Oz is surrounded by desert. She's never seen that much water in her life. And she becomes so terrified of the images in this vision that she takes a potion that keeps her awake sort of permanently. So she's no longer sleeping and no longer dreaming at all. So Lear at this point, I'm almost done. Lear at this point comes back to find her. He's still with the army who's kind of surrounding the castle. He tells her that Dorothy and company are coming to kill her. At this point, Elphaba is sort of obsessively fixated on getting the shoes back that were Nessa's shoes, because they're all that she has left of her family. Her mental state is not good. She hasn't been sleeping. She's not thinking straight. And so she's just permanently focused on getting these shoes back, and that's all she wants. And so she sends out like a pack of dogs to go bring them in. And of course the Tin Woodman kills the dogs. She sends out her bees to deliver a message, to tell them that she means them no harm. She just wants the shoes. And of course the bees are killed by the Tin Woodman as well. And then she sends out the flying monkeys to bring Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion back. She recognizes the lion as the cub that she saw when she was a student. And she wants Dorothy because all she wants is the shoes back. Now, Dorothy's been told that she's a witch and she's evil and she's out to get her at this point. So, you know, there's propaganda operating on Dorothy's mind at this point. She suspects that the Scarecrow might be Fiyero, but she knows that's not true. And it is confirmed later the Scarecrow wasn't Fiyero. He wasn't turned into the Scarecrow like in the musical, but her mind is kind of damaged at this point, and so she just is kind of clinging onto someone who might know her because she feels completely lost and alone and broken. The monkeys bring Dorothy and the lion in. Elphaba wants her sister's shoes. She doesn't mean Dorothy any harm, but when Dorothy tries to beg forgiveness for killing Nessa for dropping her house on him, it sends Elphaba over the edge because she never got the chance to ask forgiveness from Sarima about Fiyero's death and the affair, and so the pity coming from Dorothy begging for forgiveness for the death of Nessa is too much for her. She sort of has a mental break, and she is ranting, and her outfit catches on a candle and catches fire. Dorothy, not knowing any better, runs down to the well, the one that Lear almost drowned in, grabs a bucket of water, throws the water on the witch, and she dies. So she does melt. Now, something happens in the book, and it's not explained in any kind of explicit language. There's this suggestion that something magical happens in this moment. She does seem to die, but there's references to a goddess, and there's this strange vision. She sees kind of her life flash before her eyes, and something happens. And it isn't until like way later in other books that we find out what actually happened here. But for all intents and purposes, Elphaba does die. The water does kill her. It is poisonous to her. So she melts. And then, of course, everyone celebrates that the witch is dead, and she becomes sort of a legend. And there's this suggestion that she becomes sort of a folk character. This is the illustration for the last part. I didn't show it at the beginning because it's a spoiler, but the last section is called The Murder and the Afterlife, and it's the moment when Dorothy kills Elphaba, and it's very sad, but the artwork in this book is so good. I love it so much. And so the book ends with a recitation of like a folk story that was told earlier, where, you know, there's this character named Saint Elphaba with Aelphaba, and she kind of retreats behind a waterfall, and she's never seen again. And the children ask, you know, does the witch ever come back? And the person says, not yet. And so there's this sort of suggestion that in the minds of the people, Elphaba is seen as someone who may return in the future. Now, this is spoilers, so we'll get into this, but Elphaba does not return. But we do find out what happens to her in the Another Day series. There's sort of a weird thing that happens with the Grimoire where her soul is sort of sucked into the book. So like she dies, but she kind of lives on as a spirit in the book. And she's able to communicate to Rain, her granddaughter, who we will meet in a later book. So if you're wondering what happened to Elphaba, spoilers and all, that's what happened. She does die. Her soul kind of gets sucked into the Grimoire, and she sort of lives there as a disembodied spirit. That's kind of weird. Now, if you enjoyed this, I know this is long and rambling and chaotic. If you enjoyed this, I may do this for the other books in the series. But anyways, that's as much as I can remember. We're going to end there because this is way too long a video already. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.